MacDowell is America's oldest arts residency program with 450 acres and 31 artist studios in Peterborough, New Hampshire, located on the traditional homelands of the Western Abenaki people, and our gallery space here in New York is located on Lenape land. At MacDowell, we believe that art can be a powerful tool for imagination, leading towards transformation. We are committed to providing space for such work to be created. At our residency, artists stay for 2 to 6 weeks and are provided time, space, and 3 chef-prepared meals a day, as well as a community of multidisciplinary peers to work with: visual artists, filmmakers, playwrights, choreographers, composers, architects, journalists, and more. Past fellows include Ta-Nehisi Coates, Celine Song, James Baldwin, Leonard Bernstein, Polly Applebaum, Gia Tolentino, and Carrie Mae Weems, among thousands of others. We also present annual awards and national public programs like this one around topics affecting our artist communities. This talk is the second in a series of 3 this year, created in partnership with the Henry Luce Foundation. Tonight, 3 leading artists and advocates will share about their experiences, work, and collaborations within the art world and the museum system, discussing perspectives on repatriation, institutional change, and the expanding horizon of contemporary American art, among other topics. After the conversation, there's going to be a brief Q&A and time to speak informally to those of you in person. To participate in the Q&A virtually, please send your questions to events@macdowell.org. And in room, you should have some pieces of paper that my colleagues will collect just before the Q&A starts. There's also some just in the back. Our next talk is scheduled for Tuesday, September 30th, and we hope to see you there. To moderate this talk and introduce you to all of our panelists, I'd like to introduce the interim president of the Henry Luce Foundation, Sean Buffington.
Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Great to see you all here, and hello to folks who are online. This is a really exciting evening, I think, or at least I expect it to be. I'd like to welcome 3 guests. Unfortunately, our 4th panelist had a bit of a medical emergency. She's okay, but she won't be able to join us. That's Jessere Growing Thunder. But I'm very pleased to welcome the 3 folks that you see sitting down right now. Their detailed biographies were online, and I think you're also going to see them up here. But I will just very briefly introduce them. To my immediate right is Candice Hopkins, and right behind her there you can see where she spends a lot of her time, which is the Forge Project in upstate New York. Candice, great to see you. Thanks for being here. Next to her, we have Carl Duncan. Carl is the director of the Poeh Center at the Pewaukee Pueblo in New Mexico, and we'll probably be seeing some images of that in just a minute. So great to have you, Carl. And finally, Cara Romero. Cara is an artist, a photographer. I think, are you a MacDowell alum as well, Cara? No? All right, well. Soon. Get on that, Brett. But it's great to have Cara here with us as well, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So by way of starting us off and maybe also sort of introducing yourselves in a way, I'd love to ask you just to start by telling us what you're working on right now that you are most excited about. And maybe we'll start with Candice.
Sure. Thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. Right now, was just sharing pictures back in the green room of what I'm most excited about and what I'm deeply involved in. It's a reader on Native visual sovereignty. It's called Native Visual Sovereignty, and it looks at art and performance from and by Native people since 1969. 1969, for most people, is described as the beginning of the self-determination era for Native people. really sparked by the occupation of Alcatraz that started in November of 1969. And I think we can understand the occupation of Alcatraz by the Indians of all tribes, despite the, in some ways, problematic erasure of California native, let's say, traditional territory since the beginning of time also of Alcatraz Island, really as a kind of proto-land back movement. But in 1969 was also the publishing of a really incredible document out of the Institute of American Indian Arts, and it was called New Native Theater, an Artistic Experiment and Process. And that was a document that was co-authored by Lloyd Kivanugh, who was then president of IAIA and the first president. He was Cherokee. And Roland Meinholtz, who was the first director of theater and dance at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And what was really incredible about that document is they framed it by way of notes. They framed it by way of propositions. They framed it by way of scripts, all towards what they thought was the beginnings of a theater and performance, let's say, era that was defined by improvisation, and it was defined by experimentation. And the very next year, really what they needed was a stage. And the very next year, they devised a stage that was designed by, it was the first major building by the designer Paolo Soleri. And so it was an incredible moment. So this reader is 530 pages long. It has 14 reprinted essays, 3 new essays. I've written, I think, 25,000 words as part of that book. But part of the reason that I'm really excited about it is because there hasn't yet been a kind of reader on Native art, let alone the ideas of visual sovereignty. So.
Carl.
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Carl Duncan, and I'm Arikara, Hidatsa, Mandan, and San Carlos Apache. And I work for the Pueblo Poeh in New Mexico. And the Poeh Cultural Center is a tribal museum that's run by the Pueblo. And so we're really fortunate to be able to do a lot of things that I think a lot of museums or organizations, institutions can't do. And some of the things that we try to do is focus on community and artists support. And so we've done a number of programs throughout the years, but we're kind of looking at a regathering of Pueblo Poeh cultural heritage to come back home. And so a lot of the surrounding pueblos are known for a lot of the other different types of pottery, black on black pottery, different polychrome types of pottery there in New Mexico. But Poeh, a lot of times when you go places, you don't see a lot of their material culture out there. And due to history with the Spanish over the years, there's always been that difficulty of trying to have a proper place and a strong identity that the community can identify with. And so we're trying to bring back a lot of this pottery that's out there in different institutions. And so we had tribal members here last month, and we were at the American Museum of Natural History, and we're looking at some of the pottery that we have there. Next week we'll be going to Berkeley and going to the Phoebe Hearst collection there and looking at some other pottery that was taken away during the turn of the century. And so during that time period of the vanishing Indian, a lot of these institutions collected pottery. And so you'll find a lot of the Poeh pottery material culture is elsewhere rather than in Poeh itself. And so we're trying to bring those home. At the Poeh Center, we teach different cultural arts, and we've been doing that for over 35 years. And we have pottery studios, we have jewelry studios, and we have studios that teach moccasin making, weaving, basket making. And so we do that every year, and we have it's free classes to tribal members. And so we're trying to bring those home so that they can be, again, activated and of use to the community rather than in storage in places that are hard for communities members to go find and visit. So that's what we're working on right now.
Thanks, Carl. Cara.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out this evening. My name is Cara Romero. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Chemehuevi Indian tribe. I live in Santa Fe, and I'm a contemporary fine art photographer. I've also done a lot of activism work as the director of the Bioneers Indigeneity program for 14 years. I own a gallery and studio in downtown Santa Fe, and I'm excited right now to have my first major museum solo show that opened up at the Hood Museum. It's called Panapu Nuwugai, Living Light. It is a survey of about 14 years of work after I graduated from school and really found my voice in the Santa Fe Indian art community. Somehow I turned around 14 years later and had 67 pieces up in a museum. That show's gonna travel. I am shooting film for the first time in 17 years, and that was really my first love affair with photography. So I have been experimenting and falling back in love with that film and the dark room, and I'm excited to show some of that work at Santa Fe Indian Market in a couple weeks.
Thanks, Cara. So when we, the four of us, spoke last week in prepping for this, one of you, and now it might have been Candice, I'm not sure, made a comment that we might want to start by kind of level setting, that we didn't have a good sense of what the audience might know or not know about Indigenous art and collections and curation. And so let's jump in there and maybe try to define a little bit of the terrain that we're going to be talking about. It seems to me, as an outsider, that one of the things that distinguishes Indigenous artists and curators from non-Indigenous artists and curators is the nature of their relationship to community. That there is a sense of mutual obligation that exists as opposed to a kind of, to a specific community as opposed to a kind of abstracted audience. And that's often a starting point for the kind of work that Indigenous artists and curators do. Let's just start by saying, do you think, I mean, I'm an outsider, you tell me, does that resonate with you? Does that sound right? Cara?
I would say certainly we're beholden to community, and that looks not only like our own individual communities that have tremendous dynamics and diversity from tribe to tribe, but also to beholden to Native community and staying abreast of contemporary dialogue and how we articulate about different subject matter within our art, but also that visual sovereignty piece. You know, we're also individuals with individual experiences, and I think it's a unique way to make work. When you are beholden to community, there's really strict cultural protocols from tribe to tribe and from community to community. And so I think that thoughtfulness goes into all of our work. I would also say for me and for many artists, there's also a sense of service to community. And for me, with art making from, and photography making from outside of community versus inside of community, there's an incredible edit that happens, and so this idea of like self-representation through art becomes a very powerful way to make social change, way to speak across culture, way to speak within culture. And so I think that is one of my favorite things about being a Native artist, is being able to have so much critical dialogue happen through art in maybe a way that I would never be able to have.
No, I agree. Community is where you get your values. Where and once you are able to understand and participate and gain through experience those values, then we kind of depend on leaders or artists to kind of show us the way of, how do we problem solve. And a lot of times, artists are the people to kind of show us visually or make us feel the things that we need to feel in a contemporary sense. And so, we do depend on artists just as much as we depend on our community leaders for that. And although community is always first, and that's how we've survived over hundreds and hundreds of years. It's through those community activists, those leaders, those traditional leaders that have always kind of shown us the way of how to overcome difficult times.
Yeah. So I think, Sean, your theory is proving right. I think we have a responsibility to our communities. I'm a citizen of Carcross Tagish First Nation, which is in Yukon, Canada. And I was so excited about the book, I didn't say where I was from. And I'm Gannuk Study Clan, and we had a referendum in my community, I'd say 12 or so years ago, and the referendum was whether we wanted to return to a more traditional form of governance, which is clan-based. So your representative in your clan, which is always the eldest or the most knowledgeable woman, is the one who then you speak to if you want to air, concerns or changes or give feedback. And that referendum passed, so we've went back to a clan system of governance. And but I was going to say, part of what we negotiate and what I negotiate, I think we all do as museum directors, artists, as curators, is we are also beholden to community, and you really feel that. Like if someone feels like something's going a little sideways, they're going to tell you right away, and that's also like that kind of sense of feedback, right? But at Forge Project, where I work, we are on land that was where there was the forced and deliberate removal of Mohican people since the early 1700s. And actually late 1600s. And so where I run a cultural organization for Native cultural leaders on land of profound displacement. And the majority of Mohican folks now live in and near Bowler, Wisconsin, actually on Menominee territory through an agreement with them. And so one of the big questions we have at Forge is, what does it mean to be, to occupy this space, a space of displacement? How do you kind of leverage the resources at the institution where I work so that it can be to the benefit also of homeland people? And to that end, we consider ourselves actually working kind of in a formal diplomatic relationship with the tribe. So we have a formal memorandum of understanding that was ratified and signed by tribal council and then also by us that outlines 3 years of priorities, and 3 years of priorities that directly benefit the tribe. It's not about us as an institution, but of their benefit. And I feel like when we work in community, that's always the question of, who benefits and, how do we decenter ourselves, because the art world can be so much about centering individuals and individual voices, and that sometimes is in contradistinction to community values.
Maybe just a quick follow-up for all three of you. How do you, maybe you can give us some examples of how this plays out in your own work. And Carl, you talked a little bit about the repatriation work with the Poeh materials that you've been engaged in, but the precedent for that, in a way, at Poeh was the repatriation from the Smithsonian of the 100 pots. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that in this context of kind of the obligation to community.
Right. What was great was we worked with the collections director, Cynthia Chavez Lamar, who is a Pueblo person herself, and she is now the director of the National Museum of the American Indian, which is great. But before that, she was working with the Poeh Center to bring back 100 pieces of Pueblo, Tewa Pueblo pottery. And so we're trying to find ways and to be creative. You know, repatriation has some different guidelines that you need to meet to be able to have it meet that legal status. And so we tried to find a way that the pottery could still be at the Poeh Center under Poeh management. And so we created a shared stewardship agreement. And so we were able to house and manage and take care of the pottery now back in the homelands of where they came from. And along with our classes, we're able to open up the cases and have classes that are based off of the pottery. And so community members can then hold and feel and touch the pottery, which you know, would be so hard for some of the tribal members or elders to go out and see it in DC. The cost is great. But now we're pretty much right in the middle of Tewa country, and it's about 5 to 20 minutes from any of the surrounding communities. And so now they're back home, and we're hoping that they are there indefinitely, and that this agreement that we're trying to finalize would enable not just the Poeh to be able to see it, but that the surrounding Tewa tribes could also have say in how they would want it to be managed. And in the future, if they have a cultural center of their own, they're able to still be able to access their collections, and we would be able to help facilitate that with our relationship with the Smithsonian. So we're really excited about that. We're seeing a need, we actually need a bigger space for it now because we're trying to bring back more collections, and so we're working on that. But it's really just activating these cultural items that just have been sitting there for you know, over 100 years, and so it's you know, the experts are in the community and the artists themselves, and so we're really fortunate that NMAI has been able to recognize that, and they're kind of moving towards that direction.
Cara, not that I want to pick the project for you to talk about, but we just saw it up on the screen a minute ago, which was the Billboards project, which certainly struck me. I mean, unfortunately, I didn't get to see them in situ, but really struck me just seeing the images of them, and seems to me that is maybe also a kind of example of the way in which community engagement and community obligation kind of appears in your work.
That was, I'm glad you picked, because I think that each one kind of lends itself differently to the conversation. I do want to say a lot of it has to do with the work that I make with agency for the storytelling, agency for the shared stories, you know, the person that's collaborating in the photography, for them to have agency over their image, over the story. And sometimes that involves family, that involves grandma, that involves, you know, people that hold designs in community. So it can actually get pretty layered pretty fast. With that particular project, there were lots of layers. For one, it took place in Coachella Valley as part of the Desert X biennial. And while it's shared ancestral territory, it's present-day Agua Caliente land. And so I was the first Native artist that had been invited to do the land-based installation from California, which is a huge responsibility because we're beholden to community, but because they wanted a response to the landscape, you know. And I did go to Agua Caliente Tribal Council and ask permission, and even put forward the concept. And at first I thought I would work with local tribal members, but there seemed something forced about that, because of my experience I wanted to work with maybe the sister tribes conversation. And we've visited each other for thousands of years in social ways, in cultural exchange. The Chemehuevi, the Cahuilla, the Mojave, and the Serranos are all very close, but not by present day, you know, all separated out by reservation era situation. And the little boys that appear, they represent themselves, but they also represent time travelers, and they're visiting their sister tribe and responding to the landscape in that way. And so that was kind of, you know, that protocol that we follow, and then just really some, how can you be genuine to your sister tribes and honor those relationships. But I felt like in the process, it was so much problem solving. You know, like this was so much responsibility. How am I ever gonna do this in somebody else's ancestral homelands? And I think it turned out really beautiful for everyone. Agua Caliente, the Cahuillas, the Chemehuevis, everybody was happy. The best part was the kids going out to see themselves on the billboards.
And I would strongly recommend to folks to go to Cara's website, and you can see some of the images of the, not just the photos, but on the billboards in the location. And it really is spectacular. And there's a way where they really do, because of the, maybe it's just the photo, but they, they almost look on the billboards like they are kind of floating above the earth and above the landscape, that they really are, in a sense, coming from another place, from another time or dimension. It's gorgeous. And so I'm going to switch gears slightly here and come back around to Candice. So we've been talking a lot about the obligation of artists and curators, Native artists and curators, to their communities and to Native community broadly. So I'm curious, where does that leave non-Indigenous audiences and potential audiences? How do those of us who are on the outside engage with Indigenous art collections, exhibitions, in a way that is thoughtful, responsible, and ethical?
I'm going to quote my colleague, Sarah Biscaradilli, who's the Director of Indigenous Relationality at Forge. They're a brilliant scholar and thinker, and when we started doing collaborations at Forge, we kind of noticed that there was a document that we needed, and that document, which we still don't have, but we talk about a lot, is called Ethics of Relation. Because what we realized was that the best collaborations we had started with shared values, and the best collaborations we had also wasn't the kind of collaboration where you know, an organization would approach us with their idea of what they wanted us to do for them. Like, that's number one. One thing that I talk about a lot is, even if you're working with an individual or an artist, is like, don't show up to the table about all the things that you need. You're desperate for a land acknowledgement, or you have this idea and all the things you want them to do, because they're probably kind of oversubscribed already. Because I know, and this is a good thing, I think that there's been a real openness and a shift, I'd say, in the last 5 years, especially on this island, towards, you know, understanding different protocols of relation, and also trying to grapple with settler histories here. So that creates like a kind of deep demand. So, you know, I always share with people that, like, think more about, you know, if you're going to engage or want to engage and do a collaboration, you know, what resources do you have to offer instead of like framing it the other way around. And sometimes, like, if you're just starting a relationship, like, just think about what you can give instead of what you can take. Because I think a lot of our relationships can be extractive, even when we don't intend them to be extractive. And then the other thing that I've been thinking, and we've been thinking about a lot, is when we develop kind of protocols, sometimes you have to develop protocols because they're a set of guardrails, let's say, but you also have to develop them kind of not with the best person in mind, but in some cases the worst, because otherwise they're not effective, you know? And I think that that's why we have so many protocols in our community. We certainly do in Tlingit community, I know in Pueblo community for sure. And I think that they're there because it helps create good relations. If we start to lose those protocols, then, you know, and I think capitalism for sure erodes that, and extraction erodes that. I think our exhibition calendar erodes that. So, you know, think of those as kind of grounding.
So I thank you for that. I'm now really gonna kind of shift gears, introduce a new topic that, well, I'm gonna just throw it out there and we'll see. I think maybe it's a little controversial, but that's a good thing. So as somebody, again, looking in from the outside, it seems to me that there are two indigenous art worlds that don't maybe intersect always very much in terms of museums, in terms of the market, and maybe even in terms of individual artists. You can tell us that, Cara. And I'm talking about what seems to me from the outside as a kind of chasm between contemporary indigenous art and traditional indigenous art. Now, I think this is in a lot of ways, and well, we'll see what you think, a harmful and maybe a false dichotomy, which of course doesn't make it any less real. How do you think about this dichotomy? I mean, do you accept it? Does it affect you as an artist or as curators and museum professionals? Do we need to put it to rest, or does it still have some value or use?
I'll go for it. I think about this idea of false dichotomy, and I think from within culture, it doesn't exist. And I could be wrong, but we don't really exist as contemporary artists without the foundation upon which we were raised. And some of us are gonna grow up different, and we're gonna be, as artists, it's this deep relationship with creator that is really, you know, very individual. We come from communities where things have been passed down for thousands of years, and we don't exist without those traditional iconography, visual vocabulary, but also more than that, those arts are about our ecosystem and our relationship with land and our place in the universe and our creation stories. And so here again, we don't exist without pottery and without weavings and without the survivance that those arts gave to our educational values. There's a lot of seeds of knowledge buried in those arts about how to be good to the land, about how to think seasonally, about how to be a good person, you know, to communities. So I think those arts are the foundation of who we are. For me, I feel like my path was also like the kid in public school that, you know, wasn't like the Native people 100 years ago, and that's okay too. And so I think in that individual journey, you know, as Native people, it's very important for our youth and for young people and from people outside of community and even for ourselves to understand that that's okay, that we have, our culture has come through time like water and moved around, relocation and boarding schools and technology and music education, and we still have those foundations that appear in our contemporary art forms. So for me, they don't exist without each other. And so there's very much a reciprocal relationship from within community. Visually, you know, often our foundational works come through as very object-oriented. You know, there we have, but there's, you know, a lot of beauty wrapped up in that. And so I think it's okay for us as human beings and institutions and museums, we have a real need to categorize things. You know, it's just the way our brains work, you know, across the world, you know. But really when it comes to cultural arts, I don't see them as separate.
No, yeah, I agree. A lot of communities in different tribes, they don't even have a word for art. It's, you know, it's about the making of something. It's about something specific, because the, you know, the pot, the rug, you know, the piece of jewelry, the regalia, they all had really specific purpose. And so it wasn't something that was separate from the community. It had a complete purpose, and it had a story behind it. It had layers of stories that, again, yeah, like taught you how to be a good person in your community. And they had talked about, you know, the stars, they talked about creation stories, they talked about different values, family values, and so those are reminders, and you wore that, you know, you wore all of those reminders, those prayers, and you made those things in your home, and you used them throughout your even your home itself was a creation that had a process and had value in it. And so I agree that today, you know, in a Western sense of art, sometimes we can see in many instances about the self, and that there's a solo person is for me, versus it's for the community, it's for the reasons and the values that we were brought up with or were taught. And so I see now the same thing, you know, where we like to label things, and even in different in New Mexico, you know, types of pottery, but there was intermarriages. You know, there were communities that lived right next to each other, you know, and so styles blended, and styles blended throughout different time frames. And so to try to say, you know, something is so just one thing, black and white, it's not the case. You know, it's a lot deeper than that.
Yeah. At risk of also saying something controversial, I think that this dichotomy kind of emerges because of a deficit in understanding the complexity of so-called traditional work or customary work. And also that deficit when you want to label it solely as art. I think even the category as art or even contemporary art sometimes isn't as malleable enough, doesn't have enough knowledge. And so I'll give an example. One of my favorite works is something that we would do, but coastal communities did do for a long time, and it was highly effective. So to avoid, you know, warfare or some other kind of, you know, violence between communities, you know, if someone did wrong, a leader or something happened, or even actually in community, they would erect a shame pole. So that pole was a marker that there had been a wrong, and that pole was a marker that there had been a wrong that hadn't been righted as long as that pole remained standing. And when it was taken down, it meant that, you know, relations were resolved again. But you can't say that's an artwork, even though now it might be in a museum and classified as such, right? So I actually think that the so-called traditional work has been the site of governance, it's been the site of trade, it's been the site of diplomacy, it's been the site of extreme aesthetic innovation since time immemorial. And we actually need to totally reframe the ways in which, you know, much of that work is written about, talked about, understood. And largely it's site-specific, it's social practice, it's collaborative, it's highly conceptual.
So that, you've all three of you kind of pointed us maybe toward my next question, which gets at the ways in which kind of Western art historical structures, institutions, academia, museums, et cetera, have helped to create these kinds of distinctions, and have sort of cleaved the traditional and the contemporary, and the art versus the art versus use object, et cetera. And so I guess my question is, how are we doing? Is it getting better? It does seem to me, and here I'm talking about the Western institutions, it does seem to me that we are starting to see maybe increased recognition on the part of non-Indigenous art institutions, that Indigenous artists, communities, traditions are alive and thriving. We're seeing more exhibitions, newly reinstalled permanent collections, more engagement by institutions with the makers of art and with descendant communities. And maybe we're even seeing a little bit more humility and a more respectful stance in some cases on the part of non-Indigenous institutions. Do you see that, the three of you? Do you perceive that progress is being made? And if so, what do you think is both been accomplished and what still has to be done?
Okay. You're looking at me, so I'll go first. Well, I think there's been change, particularly in the last 5 years. But I would say that the place that's been the slowest to change, if we're talking about contemporary art, is this place, Manhattan. It's been the most resistant, I would say, even though it had a really robust contemporary movement in the 60s and 70s here. It had the first native-run commercial gallery in the United States that we know of, the earliest, run by Lloyd Oxendine. And that started in the late 60s, early 70s in New York. I feel like the institutions that purport to represent American art have done a very poor job of representing Native artists. And I think that needs to change. But I actually think that most of the change is happening in smaller regional museums. And I think most of the really pertinent conversations are happening in the Southwest, in Oklahoma, on the West Coast, and I think sometimes they filter, up north. But I would say one of the biggest things that needs to happen is, it's very recently that places have acknowledged settler histories, they've acknowledged displacement. But I think until there's honest conversations about that, any form of museum representation isn't really going to feel, and from my perspective, to be, it won't be sustainable.
Do you want me to go? Yeah. I come more from the experiential background, and for sure things have changed. I feel like when I first started out in the late 90s making photography, I was very much an outsider to museums, to institutions, but also even to my own Native community and places like SWAIA. And the Institute had had its first dark room at that point. People had made a little bit, thank goodness, there were people that came before me that I don't think I would have known about unless I had gone to tribal college, And so fast forward to, photography has made a transition as well into major institutions, but certainly American collections are dealing with their grave reckoning of the demographics, very poor demographics. For me, it's still very exciting, and I wonder about this piece of sustainability because we've been making the most incredible art in the world in a parallel universe, unnoticed by Manhattan and by New York. So we're showing up with such a force, because we're practiced, because we're conceptual, because we're thoughtful, because we're some of the best makers and thinkers in the world. And so for me, I hope it's sustainable, because I think that there's a wealth of ideas, of content, of stories that I feel like Americans are hungry for. And at the same time, just to go back to that, what you were talking about earlier, we're also still emerging, like our generation is still emerging from like the great cultural privacy. The great cultural privacy being this way of passive resistance to resist corruption of culture, exploitation, theft of intellectual property. Like these things happen, like when you were asking about the responsibility, you know, like these things have happened to our communities over and over and over. And so we're emerging with this like platform, but we like better be really careful with it. You know, is kind of that sense, like when we are beholden to community. And so I would ask that outsiders be very careful with that too.
No, I think there's been a lot of improvement over the years, but you know, sometimes it's forced upon. You know, there have to be laws like NAGPRA that have to force institutions to do the right thing, do what's ethical. You know, return things that were dug up in graves. I mean, you know, give back, you know, human remains. I mean, it's almost insane that any human around the world would have to be forced to do that. Rather than just doing the right thing. So, you know, that NAGPRA, you know, happening in the early 90s and through now, you know, even having another new law to, again, push that even again, because it wasn't happening at the rate it should be happening. And that was very recently. But, you know, there's a lot of institutions, Native institutions, and therefore artists where funding is in jeopardy. And you know, I went to school at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and now I'm on the board for the school. And you know, we're facing some financial uncertainty because of the politics that are happening now. And so what we you know, sometimes we take for granted that things are going so well, and all of a sudden, very quickly, they're not. And it trickles down. You know, I had some interns, some students that were interning at the Poeh Center, and they were thinking of going to IA, and they're ready to go. And I asked them how they were doing, and they said, you know, I'm probably not going to go to IA. I'm looking at other schools now because they're scared of what might happen. You know, I reassured them, you know, we're addressing this. You know, don't worry about it. You know, we're still moving forward. Encourage the student, and you know, they jump back on, and next week they'll be going to a summer bridge program, and they're going to be going to school there. But it does have effects, you know, it does trickle down. I'm on the Santa Fe Arts Commission, and we're lucky that, you know, we get funding from a different source, but a lot of other nonprofits, organizations in New Mexico and Santa Fe, you know, had a lot of grants that were in jeopardy, terminated, delayed, and things like that. And you know, those monies, you know, trickle down to artists for opportunities. And now in the future, are they going to come with different stipulations and restrictions? And so all these things, you know, when we feel things are improving, they may not. And I think it's, you know, going to take us to remember our values, and that we are a community, and that together, you know, we can problem solve. And it does take a lot of ideas from artists and organizations, elected leaders, to be able to come together to find solutions. It may not be exactly what we want on a large scale, but in these kind of smaller community, city, municipalities, or state ways, we can keep pushing things forward. And I think that's what I'm hoping to try to do where I'm at. But it is unfortunate that, you know, that does drain a lot of the time that we have when we should be already moving forward, helping artists, helping community members in programming.
I'm really glad that you turned our attention to that, Carl, because I think, first of all, for folks in the room, if you don't know, the Institute that Carl was just talking about, IAIA, I mean, is a national treasure in my opinion. It is probably the most important engine after communities themselves for the production of Indigenous, the support of Indigenous creativity. It's amazing, and it could well, it is possible. I mean, there's maybe a little bit of a glimmer of hope we were discussing earlier, but it is possible that it will lose its federal funding. It's a federally funded institution. But the other point I think I wanted to just draw attention to is that, you know, we do, you know, the arc of history bends toward justice, we hope, but it doesn't do that without our work to bend it, right? And so that progress can be eroded, it can be destroyed, it can be turned back, and it's incumbent on all of us, not just artists and curators, to fight for that not to happen, because it's happening right now, and not just to Indigenous communities and institutions, but to arts institutions of all kinds and artists, museums of all kinds. So thank you for bringing us back to that. I think we're going to switch to questions. Aha, here we go. Great. Now this could be a challenge. Let's see how I do with this. Okay, how do you balance art with social impact and art for art's sake as an artist or a curator? That's from Sabrina, and that can go to anybody.
Probably me. Let's see, art for art's sake versus art for social impact. I think it always starts from a place of needing to create, so maybe it's all art for art's sake. For me, as I've journeyed to try and be better as an artist through the years, I think that it has to have narrative. I also think that making and showing are a form of social impact and having, you know, agency over art forms. I don't think every single piece may have social impact in the ways that we expect when we're making, but what has surprised me is when things become bigger than you ever imagined. And when I look back, I think it's because when you're making, you're in this space of subconsciousness, and maybe when you're in that space, you're like tapping into the collective. And so people are gonna come and experience art with their own consciousness. And if you have held space and you have that intention, I think your hope is to communicate that, but you don't ever really know what's gonna happen. And so it's very important to continue to create from that space of purity. Otherwise, things tend to go awry. So.
I'll just answer briefly. I think that was a really generous answer. It was nice to hear you speak about the process, because what I've witnessed recently, and recently I want to say like in art criticism in the last year, particularly since the last Venice Biennale and kind of in the face of it, this idea of art for art's sake has been weaponized against mainly artists of color, Indigenous artists. And part of the reason is that I think sometimes people want to glorify that there was a kind of era where there was this sort of arts for art's sake, which was a kind of privileged position by certain artists, often like white male artists, let's say like abstract expressionists. But they were responding to their own ideas of an exclusion of an artistic language. So even their work wasn't art for art's sake. So I would question whether that even really exists in a way, especially in this world, especially under this administration. That's just my perspective.
Here's this one may be for Carl. If a museum were interested in beginning to explore a practice of return repatriation, how would they do that, especially if they are just getting started and they may not have a specialist on staff? What's a way to begin, or a resource that they might look to?
Well, I guess it depends on what the collection is that they're talking about, and see like if it's a part of a specific culture or tribe, and you can reach out to different tribal entities and ask them to maybe take a look at that, and they may either would like those items back, but a lot of times tribes don't want them back, and they don't know what has happened between then and how they were collected. And so, you know, for them, they feel like, you know, it's something that left and it needs to stay, because they don't know, you know, what it entails if they brought it back. And so it depends from tribe to tribe, but reaching out to the tribe, or even asking some of the tribes if they have any knowledge of that, other tribal museums, would kind of have a network of people you can ask if you start somewhere. You can always reach out to me, and you know, I can help point somebody in the right direction.
Thanks. And there are not every tribe has this, but there are also tribal historic preservation TIPOs, tribal historic preservation officers, and there is an organization called NATHPO, the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, who might be able to provide at least some initial connection if you...
Right, yeah. And there's an online website where just lists all the tribes and all their THIPO officers and offices and phone numbers and things like that.
And that might be a place to start also, especially if you're talking about a very particular set of objects. So this one might be for you, Candice. This is about, ooh, wow, okay. How, yeah, I guess we're winding down. Let's make this a good one. How do, I mean, the way I'm understanding this question is essentially, how do curators think spatially and kind of structurally when they're creating exhibitions, in order, how does a kind of indigenous-driven or indigenous grounded perspective kind of manifest itself in the actual design of exhibition?
Wow. Well, I think there's no essential indigenous, number one. But one thing that I've done, and I'll use the exhibition Indian Theater as an example because there were some images behind. With that exhibition, I thought of, one, this question of, if I was going to do an exhibition that was really centered on Native performance and visual sovereignty, how is that enacted in the space? So sometimes when I see exhibitions, I feel like the design of the exhibition or the way that it's displayed can kind of be in kind of counter service to the theme. So it might feel really static. So you go inside and everything feels really fixed or static, or you see items, cultural items that are meant to be danced, or they're masks that have dances and songs and ceremony associated with them, but then all of a sudden you see them and they're not moving, they're not in motion. So for Indian theater, we had these kind of constellation of events that happened, and event kind of going back to Fluxus is like an event score, right? So if you think of an exhibition design kind of like an event score, then you have a kind of time frame in which it unfolds. And this has been really helpful for me to think about exhibitions, and I don't think it's necessarily purely kind of an indigenous way of looking at it, but I was thinking more, how do I design an exhibition that feels active, that feels, I don't think it'll ever really feel sovereign, but what might it feel self-determined? Might the works that I'm working with feel like they have agency? It's a really hard thing to do because there's no kind of guidebook for it. A lot of that is like feel, actually. And, you know, to get back even to Forge, like many of us at Forge, not all of us come from art backgrounds, not all of us come from curatorial backgrounds, but Sarah and I do. And more recently, I've been thinking about, you know, at Forge, in collaboration with Stockbridge Munsee community, how can we make that feel like it's not even a part of the United States right now? So that's a curatorial project.
So we also have a question here, which was, can you talk more about the ethics of relations document? Who was that? Candice, was that you? Yeah.
Well, it doesn't exist yet. It's just an idea. It's a conceptual idea. I think anyone honestly could run with it. But part of the reason that we've talked about it a lot as an organization, and we want to get to the point where we can have this, is so that we can kind of have, maybe it's a one-pager that sort of shares our values. And so if we can begin by sharing our values in a potential collaboration or partnership, let's say, you can already see if there's alignment. You know, you don't have to go through 4 Zoom meetings and in-person meetings and then you realize, oh, actually, you know, we're not that values aligned. So we want to start projects that are values aligned and start projects that are really grounded in ethical relations. Because I think I've worked a lot in museums, I've worked a lot in biennials, and I think that that idea of ethical relations sometimes gets thrown by the wayside because there's timelines and there's other demands and, you know, things that need to happen in a certain way. And so we try to, you know, develop those relations at their own pace.
So I'm gonna take the final question, I think, and this is by way of wrapping up. I always like to give our audiences maybe some homework, and so in this case, I thought maybe each of you could tell us about one artist or exhibition or artistic project that you're really excited about, that you think everybody ought to know about, and the task for all of you is to seek that out, seek out that artist, seek out that exhibition, seek out that project and learn about it, provide support for it if you can, enjoy it, engage with it. But maybe we'll start with you, Cara. I was trying to spin that out a little bit while you were all thinking, but are you?
I'll spin out some answers.
All right, excellent.
Santa Fe Indian Market is coming up the 3rd weekend in August, and it continues to grow every year into shared markets and gallery spaces and self-representation. If you haven't made it to Santa Fe Indian Market, it is an incredible experience. It's like Indian art heaven. And you'll see all the types of art at Santa Fe Indian Market. I would definitely encourage folks to come to that one. And then on a smaller note, one of my favorite painters of all time, Judith Lowry, has a show at Nevada Museum of Art right now. And I didn't get to make the opening, but they're doing some really amazing work with some Native women artists, some matriarchs in the Nevada, California community. They just had one by Jean Lamar, so maybe pick up the catalog if you can't make it all the way out there, but I just love those ladies and they deeply inspire me.
Yeah, in a few weeks we have Pathways Indigenous Arts Festival, and it's an alternative space, and it was born out of the need during COVID to support artists. And so we tried to create another space, a venue for Indigenous artists to showcase their art. And so we teamed up with the tribe, Pueblo Poeh, and we worked with their resort, Buffalo Thunder Resort. And we have an indoor and outdoor market that features over 350 artists. We also have started up a film festival as well, And so we have around 50 films that we screen over 3 days. We also work with a lot of other Indigenous performers, and we have, again, I think over 30 or so different Indigenous performers, whether they're bands or solo artists, contemporary, traditional. We have them featured there. And so it's really a space that is kind of separate from Santa Fe. You can come up, it's about 15 minutes north of Santa Fe. And it's just really a nice community kind of event. And a lot of the artists there know each other, and they're able to visit with each other. But the Poeh Center, being a tribal entity, we walk water to everybody, the admission's free. We try to make it as community and friendly based and accessible as possible. And food, we also grew our food venue. I think we have about over 15 native food vendors and nonprofits. I think we have over 24 different nonprofits, native nonprofits that are there featured as well. And so we're just trying to utilize the resources of the tribe to be open to, friendly to other tribal entities. And so that's going to be a really great event.
Well, one, I would say, invite you all, if you haven't been to Forge, to come and visit us and see, in particular, because we have a meadow remediation project we've been working on for 3 years now, and it's really changed everything. It really changed our relations, and certainly our relations with the land itself. But I wanted to share, there's a kind of network of Native-led art centers in the New York region, and a really important one is Ma's House. And Jeremy Dennis is sitting in the front here. Jeremy is an amazing Shinnecock photographer, but Ma's House is an incredible example of a community-led, a community-based artist-run center that hosts residencies. They do exhibitions. They do all kinds of programs, and I would follow them on Instagram if you can, or if you don't already, on their website, because they're really, I think, showing the strength of doing an initiative that's relatively modest but is having a huge impact. So.
Excellent. And maybe also I will shout out Relative Arts, which is right here in the city. Ma's House and Relative Arts have also been grantees of the Henry Luce Foundation. But so if you can't get out to Long Island, to Shinnecock, and if you can't get to Santa Fe, you can definitely get to the East Village. So anyway, I'd like to invite everyone to join me in thanking our 3 tremendous panelists, Cara Romero, Carl Duncan, and Candice Hopkins. Thank you all so much, and thank you all for being here with us tonight. Good evening.